The time. Okay, I'm going to say hello again. I'm Teresa Kavanagh. I'm the City Councillor for Bay Ward, and I'm welcoming everyone into this meeting. And we're talking about the zoning bylaw, and we're here to answer your questions, and we have some staff here to do that. Just a reminder that the recording is on. So, we'll start the meeting by acknowledging that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation. I would like to honor the land and the peoples of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation whose ancestors have lived on this territory for a millennia and whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to the city staff who are going to put on a presentation. And then afterwards, we'll have questions and answers. And I think we'll be able to do it by a raised hands, or if you prefer, you can write a question in the question and answer. So we'll get to that after. But right now, I'm passing it over to Robert Sandercott and Sammy Aiello from the city's planning and bylaw departments. And both Robert and Sammy will be sharing an overview of the city's new bylaw and what it means to you. Okay, so over to you, Robert and Sammy.
Thank you very much, Councillor. So my name is Robert Sandercott. I'm a senior planner with the zoning unit. With me is Sammy Aiello, one of our bylaw writers for the new bylaw. If we go to the next slide, I'll have a quick agenda there. Oh, there we go. So we'll basically just quickly introduce the bylaw, and basically most of the rest of the agenda of our presentation is going through some of the sections that would be most relevant to the Britannia Village area, such as the floodplain overlay. There are certainly portions of Britannia Village that are within the floodplain, parking provisions, as well as the neighborhood zone provisions, which are the successor to the residential zone provisions in the previous zoning bylaw 2008-250. And then we'll quickly discuss next steps for the new bylaw before we open it up to the Q&A portion. If we go to the next slide, I'll start by quickly discussing the process that led to the passing of the new bylaw, which was adopted by Council on January 28th of this year. The new zoning bylaw 2026-50 is intended to implement the city's new official plan. This had its own process. The official plan is the high-level land use policy document for the city, which sets out how the city will grow and develop over the next 2 decades. Over that time, Ottawa is projected to grow by over 400,000 people, and thus the plan prioritizes the need for a full range of housing choices as a greater proportion of that growth is accommodated through urban intensification. So that plan went through a public engagement process. It was adopted by Council in 2021, approved by the Provincial Ministry of Municipal Affairs in 2022. From there, since the plan was adopted in 2022, staff developed the zoning bylaw and citywide through a fulsome engagement process that included 3 drafts. First one released mid-2024, second and third ones released at various points last year. With public engagement and city council engagement after each draft. The final version was presented to joint committee in December last year and was approved by council, as I said, on January 28th, enacted on March 11th. Next slide, please. And this just gives a bit of an overview of basically some of the sessions that really kind of led up to that point. With the previous drafts, there was quite a bit of engagement as well, both in terms of like in-person workshops, ward-specific workshops. If anyone's kind of more interested in sort of like the past drafts and sort of past comments we received, they can also go to our website at engage.ottawa.ca/zoning. That available there is anyone who wants updates on like next steps with the new zoning bylaw can certainly follow that, but also basically the engagement material that led there is also available. Go to the next slide. I will pass it off to Sammy at this point to walk us through the floodplain provisions as well as the parking provisions. Go ahead, Sammy.
Hi, everybody. So a big thing in Britannia we know is the floodplain overlay. So I'm just going to read through some of the provisions that affect development in this area. So Section 501 floodplain overlay. Just states that despite the provisions of the underlying zone or any other zoning provisions of the bylaw, development is prohibited within any area subject to a floodplain overlay. Despite this, development may be permitted in an area subject to that overlay as follows. If there's an addition to a building or structure for a use permitted in the underlying zone, which does not exceed an amount of 20% of the gross floor area of the building or 20 square meters, whichever is less. For a building or structure accessory to a use permitted in the underlying zone where it does not exceed a gross floor area of 50 square meters or height of 1 story. For a change of use from one permitted use to another, it's subject to the permit, the following uses, whether or not they are listed as permitted uses in the underlying zone or for a marine facility, a utility installation that requires approval under the Environmental Assessment Act, or for the addition of one dwelling unit located at or above grade within a residential use building containing no more than one dwelling unit as that existed as of June 25th, 2008. So the key language here is that it's located at or above grade. So we're looking to not have any of these units constructed in a basement. So here's some examples of uses that are also prohibited in a floodplain overlay. I'm not going to read them all, but just to give you some examples, coach houses are not permitted, daycares, group homes, anything light industrial uses, residential care facilities, schools, etc. And this list is on our zoning website page as well. Next thing is section 314, our flood relief provisions. So the following provisions apply to lots subject to the floodplain overlay or setbacks from surface water features for buildings that are being reconstructed as a result of flooding or buildings that are being relocated to a less flood prone location that meets or is as close as possible to the setback specified in section 404. Despite the floodplain overlay and surface water features setbacks and yard setbacks and maximum building height provisions of the underlying zone, reconstruction of a dwelling and associated permitted projections and accessory buildings in existence as of May 1st, 2017 are permitted in accordance with the location and building envelope approved in permits issued by the Conservation Authority. For buildings or structures subject to these provisions, the gross floor area of the replacement dwelling and associated permitted projections and accessory buildings must not exceed the gross floor area of the buildings and the area of the permitted projections in existence of May 1st, 2017. Despite that, in addition to a building subject to these provisions is permitted subject to not exceeding an amount equal to 20% of the gross floor area of the building or 20 square meters, whichever is less. An accessory building or structure subject to these provisions or in addition to an accessory building or structure is permitted subject to the accessory building or structure not exceeding a gross floor area of 50 square meters and a height of 1 story. Decks and other permitted projections associated with the replacement building are subject to the permitted projections section of our zoning bylaw and does not apply, and surface water feature setbacks does not apply to the deck or permitted projections. Accessory buildings and structures are subject to accessory use building and structure provisions and the setbacks from the surface water features, but that does not apply to the accessory building or structures, and a dwelling must be flood-proofed according to the standards required by the Conservation Authority. Some of the new official plan policies introduce directions such as elimination of minimum parking space rates, directs limit to surface parking in proximity to transit stations in the inner urban transect, and multiple policies in Section 5 encourage car sharing and EV spaces for larger developments. So effectively what our zoning bylaw did was we eliminated all minimum parking requirements, but we have kept minimum visitor parking requirements. The maximum number of parking spaces are limited around transit stations in the inner urban transect. And we've introduced a wide range of rules, regulations that encourage car sharing, and EV regulations have also changed as well. So some of these updates are removing the minimum parking spaces citywide. Front yard parking permissions have changed, so there's more an emphasis on where front yard parking is permitted. So effectively, anywhere in the downtown transect does not permit front yard parking, and everything outside of that, so inner urban, outer urban area, does allow front yard parking.
Which includes Britannia.
Which includes Britannia, correct. Minimum visitor parking minimums are still in effect, and bicycle parking updates have changed to now we identified as short and long-term spaces. So shorter term, more for temporary use. We don't require too much in terms of coverage and structures, and the long-term use is more of an enclosed feature that we're looking for. Front yard parking permissions have been introduced in the N1 to N6 zones in Area B on Schedule 8.5. Front yard parking is permitted subject to lot width and the prohibition of any other spots on the lot. They are permitted in a variety of non-residential zones and for all non-residential uses in the outer urban and suburban transects, including mixed-use buildings. And I'll pass over to Robert now.
Thank you very much. So I will talk about the neighborhood zones as well as the guiding official plan policies that led to the development of the neighborhood zones, which, as I said, are essentially intended to represent the residential zones in the new zoning bylaw. It's basically based on the neighborhood designation in the official plan. The big thing that I would want to highlight from the official plan policies, which is basically part 6 of the official plan, part 8 of the zoning bylaw deals with neighborhoods. But the general direction that I would really like to highlight is that policy really directs the zoning bylaw to establish form-based regulations. And what do we mean by form-based? If you look at the previous zoning bylaw originally established in 2008, it sets out different regulations depending on the type of house or the type of building that one is provided. So like a single detached house is permitted in the R1 zone, R2 zone, R3 zone, subject to a bunch of different standards. Once it's a 2-unit building, once something like a semi-detached building, they have their own different standards and they're only permitted in certain zones. Townhouses have their own different standards and they're only permitted in certain zones. In terms of shifting to a form-based standard, the intent is essentially to emphasize one consistent set of regulations for basically one built form within a neighborhood, regardless of the number of units that are within the building. There are still regulations on the number of units permitted in a building, but as much as possible, we've really tried to move to one consistent built form, regardless of how what's inside is configured. Other things I would note, the policy generally directs that building heights are low-rise. That's defined in the official plan as up to 4 stories, but that doesn't necessarily mean 4 stories everywhere. Much more commonly, the limits in the bylaw, particularly in the lower density zones, would be more of a 3-story limit. Next slide, please. So key changes from the former bylaw to the new bylaw. The 2 parts that would be most relevant to housing and residential development would be Part 7 and Part 8. Part 7 is basically our section on housing provisions, which deals with basically specific types of housing that we might need to have regulation for. Vertically attached, which is another way of saying semi-detached or townhouse units, as well as housing such as retirement homes, group homes, residential care facilities, which all have their own specific regulations in that section. Part 8 is really kind of the meat of the residential zones. That's where the neighborhood zones are dealt with. And there are 2 main sections that I would draw one's attention to within Part 8 of the new zoning bylaw. Section 801 is the neighborhood zones themselves, which, as I said, replace the residential zones in the former zoning bylaw. Overall, we really tried to compress a whole bunch of different zoning standards into a much more streamlined set of zones and subzones, and generally just easier to follow provisions overall. In most neighborhoods, do contemplate generally a 3-story height permission, which we'll get into. The other main section, Section 802, sets out additional provisions that are meant to provide generally applicable regulations to the built form. And I've kind of listed some examples down here. Functional path of travel refers to basically providing enough space for a development in order to get like from the street to the rear yard without having to go inside the building and without having to go onto a neighbor's lot, particularly for things like where a development has bicycle parking or where a development has like accessory storage in a rear yard, ensuring that there's enough functional space for people to access those sort of things, as I said, without having to access like a neighbor's property and without having to go within the building so they can get around from outside, especially with things like waste. Front and rear yard soft landscaping. Another big goal of the new official plan is with respect to tree canopy, and both in terms of retention of mature trees, but also like growth of the tree canopy, even as we permit more housing development. So the zoning bylaw cannot directly require that trees be planted, but it is able to regulate a minimum amount of landscaped area that must be provided on a lot. And the way in which we've kind of set up these rear front and rear yard soft landscaping requirements, and soft landscaping is basically like the zoning term for any sort of vegetative material. Could be grass, could be sod, could be other sort of plantings, could be a garden. Um, but basically, those requirements are intended to be organized in such a way as to ensure there's enough space in front and rear yards to either support growth of new trees or to provide enough space for the retention of existing mature trees where they exist on a residential site. Building facade standards, there's some additional standards in there with respect to, for example, like the front of a building. Like, for example, there's requirements that you have at least one entrance to a residential building facing the street. You have a house, your main entrance should face the street. Next slide. So in addition to the official plan, just to give a bit of an overview of how we got to these neighborhood zones before I introduce them further. There's also provincial legislation that zoning bylaws in Ontario have to meet, which is under the Planning Act in Ontario. There was a major amendment to the Planning Act in 2023, actually into 2022, which was Bill 23. Introduced a number of different planning changes within Ontario, but one of the most relevant ones to residential zones was Section 35.1 of the Planning Act. And what this essentially stated for municipalities in Ontario, including Ottawa, is that municipal zoning bylaws on any urban residential lot must permit up to 2 additional dwelling units within any lot containing a single detached dwelling, a semi-detached dwelling, or a townhouse dwelling. 2 additional units for basically a total of 3 units on an urban residential lot. If we go to the next slide, that will kind of highlight the implications of that and basically kind of compare what that did to the former zoning bylaw and how that implemented and carried forward to the new bylaw. So R1 zones in the former bylaw, which was basically like the single detached zone, effectively now required that 3 units be permitted on a lot. Single detached, 2 additional dwelling units. The R2 zone, which permits semi-detached dwellings, effectively now provided for up to 6 units being permitted. If you think of a semi-detached, there's 2 houses divided by a party wall, typically on individual lots. Since they're on individual residential lots, each side of the semi could now contain 3 units for a total of 6. The R3 and R4 zones permitted townhouse lots, and this effectively meant that where townhouses were permitted, 3 units were permitted in each townhouse for a total of, could be, depending on the number of townhouses, 6, 9, 12, etc. 3 times the number of townhouses. And we see that translated into the new bylaw as the N1 permitting up to 4 units. One of the directions that came out of the new zoning bylaw was that we would permit up to a total of at least 4 units on every residential lot. The N2 was intended to line up with the R2 zone and semis and just generally permit 6 units. The N3 zone permitting up to 12 units, and the N4, as we'll see, is a much more flexible residential zone. If we go to the next slide. So now that actually brings us to the end zone provisions themselves. And the basic structure of these neighborhood zones can be summarized by essentially 2 tables, this one being the first. Every neighborhood zone basically has N, a number, and a letter. The N1 or N2 or N3 portion refers to the primary zone, and then the letter afterwards referring to the subzone, which will be in the next table that we'll get into. So primary zones regulate 2 different things. One, the number of units that are permitted in a building or on a lot, and then also the maximum building height. So as I said, the N1 zone, which is the lowest density zone, is intended as a 4-unit zone. And then the N2 being a 6-unit zone, the N3 being up to 12 units. And there's two elements to it, as you'll notice there. There's a maximum per building, but there's also a maximum based on the lot area. And what that basically means is that, for example, using the N2 zone, while the N2 zones contemplate 6 units, up to 6 dwelling units in a building, so up to 6 plexes or a semi-detached dwelling with those additional dwelling units on each side, where the lot is smaller in size, so let's say maybe a 10 meter or about 33 foot lot as opposed to like a 50-foot lot, that lot may be permitted, but it may not necessarily permit a full 6 dwelling units because the lot is smaller. So using that sort of 10 meter by 30 meter lot, or 33 feet by 100, that would probably only permit in an N2 zone 4 units, even though it says 6 units per building. You also have to meet that maximum per lot area. The N4, N5, and N6 zones are basically higher density zones. As you'll see, they don't specifically limit the number of dwelling units. The N4 is the highest, like, low-rise zone. It comprises areas that generally permit up to 4 full stories. Typically, most areas that do permit up to 4 full stories were also areas that permitted that sort of density and permitted that sort of height in the previous bylaw. There are some N4 zones that do also kind of limit you to 3 stories, where we have more specific regulations there. The N5 and N6 zones, they're much more uncommon because they are intended as basically mid and high-rise zones. Because the neighborhoods designation in the official plan is primarily a low-rise designation, you're really only going to see N5 and N6 zones in areas where mid and high rises already exist, or they were already zoned in the previous bylaw to permit that height. If we go to the next slide. So this gets us to our subzones. And as I said, there's 6 subzones, basically A to F. So what they basically regulate are minimum lot widths, minimum front yard setbacks, other minimum setbacks, as well as building width. The big thing to keep in mind here is these subzones apply to all of those neighborhood primary zones that I talked about before. The C subzone applies to all of N1C, N2C, N3C, N4C, etc. If we go to the next slide. So this just is intended to give an overview of how the primary zones in the former bylaw were generally translated. And I do say generally because, as we'll see when we get to the map of the neighborhood, there were definitely specific actions taken, for example, in areas subject to the floodplain. But generally speaking, Britannia Village is part of the interurban transect in the official plan. I think we're going to see a transect map on the next slide. And okay, so this is the map of Britannia Village here. Just again, kind of giving a bit of a high level of the neighborhood zones that exist. The primary zone that you'll see there is primarily the N2 zone. So as I kind of set up before, the N2 zone is generally intended to be akin to R2 zones in the former bylaw. They contemplate semi-detached dwellings and generally contemplate up to 6 dwelling units. The big sort of difference, as you'll see the area hashed in blue, those areas hashed in blue are meant to represent that floodplain overlay. So if you remember the earlier part from Sammy's portion of the presentation, those are areas subject to those floodplain overlay provisions, which are very restrictive about like what sort of like development and what sort of additions are permitted. In fact, the starting point of that entire section is that development is prohibited in the floodplain overlay, and then there's very limited exceptions to that. And that also translated over into the zoning that we used. In general, we really tried to, in those areas subject to a floodplain, hold the zoning as closely as possible to what existed in the previous zoning bylaw. So you'll see a lot of that area in the floodplain, as a result, is zoned N1. You'll also see that there are also a couple of N3 areas, and these correspond to the location of existing townhouses within the area that previously also had the R3 zone. So the N3 in these cases is intended to recognize the existing use and density that is already there. They are in the floodplain, so again, I would reiterate that like the floodplain starts off by stating that development is prohibited, and the exceptions to that are basically limited to like things like very small additions and much more minor alterations that have to go through conservation authority approval as well. If we go to the next slide. This, for comparison, is a map of areas further to the south and east towards Lincoln Fields, which is designated as a hub in the official plan. Hubs, along with main streets such as Richmond Road, are intended to accommodate much higher amount of density permission. Those are areas that there's already much more commercial use. It's in closer proximity to transit routes and the transitway. So those are areas that are intended to get the highest density. And then, as you can kind of see here, the neighborhood zones that are used are generally more permissive compared to those further north into Britannia. Some of the policy background behind that. One of the things that's laid out in the official plan is something called basically the evolving neighborhood overlay. In plain English, what it essentially lays out is that areas in closest proximity to main streets and hubs were zoned to basically permit higher density compared to the surrounding neighborhood. Because they're in proximity to those areas that are not just zoned for higher activity, but also in many cases do have existing non-residential uses and a greater mix of uses already to begin with. If you want a closer look at the specific zoning of your property, there are individual lots, possibly with site-specific exceptions that maybe don't come clearly through here, or if you live in a different neighborhood and are interested to see what zoning applies to your lot, you can also look up your zoning through GeoOttawa, which is the city's online web mapping tool. That would be maps.ottawa.ca/GeoOttawa for anyone who's interested in looking that up themselves. Next slide. So this is the transect map I was alluding to previously. So as we see there, B is intended to represent the inner urban transect, which the Britannia area is kind of on the west edge of. Next slide. A few additional notes on parking in neighborhood zones. We added provisions to allow something we called something we started referring to as communal parking. This is intended to refer to parking areas that are provided not directly on site, but intended for use by nearby residents as an alternative to providing parking directly on site. So the intent of basically showing this is to, I think, kind of highlight that the zoning bylaw does eliminate minimum parking rates, but we have also increased basically, I think, the options for which for the way in which parking is provided or can be provided for new developments. When we talk about communal parking lots, we're really talking about things that are supposed to be, I think, fairly small in size, so that if someone basically kind of provides parking off-site in this fashion, it's of a size that's really limited to use by nearby residents and is of a size that really kind of minimizes the impact on the surrounding residential neighborhood. Go to the next slide. Other changes to note, I'll go through these really quickly. When we talk about a dwelling unit being equivalent to an additional dwelling unit, I was kind of basically alluding to how the provincial regulations require like additional dwelling units be permitted within detached and semi-detached dwellings. The intent of that is really just to communicate that regardless of whether we call something a principal dwelling unit or an additional dwelling unit, the same number of dwelling units are intended to be permitted in a building. Using the M2 as an example, that permits up to 6 units. That can come in the form of a 6-unit apartment building or a 6 units by way of a semi-detached with additional dwelling units. They're both permitted. They're both intended to be regulated the same way. You don't get more permissive regulations by calling something one thing or the other. Large unit requirements of 80 square meters or 2 bedrooms. So in dwellings generally containing, I believe it's 6 or more dwelling units, 1 in 6 needs to be at least 80 square meters or at least two bedrooms. The official plan policies do talk about a certain number of like large dwelling units, basically to ensure that there's basically a mix of sizes of units in association with new development, and that's implemented through large unit requirements in Part 7. Next slide. So this is just to give a quick overview of where we're at. As I said, January 28th was approval by City Council. March 11th was when the bylaw was enacted. New zoning bylaws as well as amendment to zoning bylaws in Ontario are subject to a statutory appeal period where people who commented and didn't necessarily agree with certain elements of the new zoning bylaw can appeal that to the Ontario Land Tribunal. That appeal period ended in April. What we can confirm is that there were appeals received against a number of different provisions of the new zoning bylaw. Until it's in full force and effect, the most restrictive provisions apply between the old bylaw 2008-250 and the new 2026 bylaw. So it has been enacted by council. It's not yet in full force. Basically what has to happen is the OLT, which is a provincial body, would need to declare those portions that aren't appealed to be in full force. I think we've estimated this to be sometime by September, but keep in mind that is an estimate. That's not set in stone. That is a provincial body that has to declare things in force. Next slide. Another note in terms of next steps, when we talk about exceptions and schedules, this is a bit more of a site-specific review. Some zoning provision or some zones may be subject to, if you look in the zone code, a number that's in square brackets at the end of the zone code. So like, for example, this isn't quoting a real zone necessarily, but like N2C bracket 300, which refers to an exception. So these are basically site or area specific regulations, most of which were carried forward from exceptions in the current zoning bylaw. So going forward, because most of these were carried forward and do still need to be reviewed for conformity with the new official plan, that's going to be a review going forward in 2026 and 2027. So anyone dealing with like more existing site-specific exceptions, those are still under review because they've so far just been carried forward from the former bylaw. And I believe that takes us to the end of the presentation. For anyone who, again, wants to follow the new bylaw or kind of read any of our past engagement material, engage.ottawa.ca/zoning is basically our website. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can handle questions live if people put up their hands, or if they prefer, they can write it out. If that, you don't want to speak, that's fine too. So we'll just wait to see if you either raise your hand or you put in something in the questions and answer box. I don't see anything yet. Don't be shy. Even if it's about your own place, that's okay. Just to give you an idea. I'm not seeing anything.
Oh, I see a raised hand.
Yeah, we have a question from Shelley Rivier, so I will.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, got one. I've got one here from Rhonda. Oh, and you've got your hand up. Sorry, Shelley. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So my biggest concern is the parking. I know it's been passed, but I'm not sure if the current situation with ownership of cars is going to match what developers are going to provide. And the result of that will be cars on streets, cars parked illegally, people, renting their space in their driveway. I'm just concerned about what will be in place to keep an eye on that.
Okay.
So I'll at least speak to, thank you very much for the question. First of all, most importantly, thank you very much. Insofar as what the zoning permits, yes, it's correct that we've moved to no minimum parking. One thing that I would note is, and this is why I think we also talked about things like the front yard parking permissions as well as the communal parking. What I think we've really tried to do is give additional flexibility as to how parking is provided on a site, so that there's much more flexibility to areas that aren't necessarily as well served by transit. There that are areas where car ownership is likely to remain high. There's still ability to provide parking in a way that doesn't kind of get in the way of some of those other goals of the official plan. The big one that I would kind of reference is that need to retain trees on site. So the front yard parking, for example, the principle behind that is that we already allow people to have like garages and in some cases like single or even double width driveways. Front yard parking basically means that like you don't necessarily need to have that driveway leading to a garage. You could build livable space like right up there and have the driveway in front of it, and basically to the same width that we would allow if we were to allow that leading to a garage. Sam, I don't know if you want to speak to the
No,
too much to inform.
You hit every point there, so I'm nothing to add for me.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Shelley. It's a very common question, and I don't think people really grasp that folks are going to live without cars. And I'm constantly getting that concern from established neighborhoods because you do have driveways, and the new infill is providing less, in some cases, none, and that concerns neighbors. I'm hearing that over and over again. So yeah, it's a very relevant question. The bottom line is that if you rent a place that doesn't have parking, then you are taking a huge risk if you think you can just put a car on the street, because at some point it's going to catch up to you. So that's a risk. But thank you. We'll go on to the next one. I've got here from Rhonda. What does this actually mean for my R1 property or the one next door to me?
Very much. So thank you very much for that question. Sandy, maybe I'll ask you to kind of bring up the zoning map slide if we're still able to share that.
Oh, sorry, one sec.
Because the R1 would certainly be the old zone in much of Britannia. The answer, of course, depends in part on whether or not it's in the floodplain overlay, because as I said, the R1 zones in the floodplain, the stated N1, and the floodplain overlay provisions do in any event restrict the ability to actually like do additions or development. Sorry, the next yeah, and then if you could just share screen so people can actually see what I'm referring to. But assuming it's not in that floodplain overlay and it's in that N2 area, I would say that the biggest differences that I would kind of note are the number of units that could be permitted within a single building would effectively be going from 3 to 6. So if you remember where we kind of talked about that Bill 23 comparison between the former bylaw and the new bylaw, the R1 being a detached only zone had to permit up to 3 dwelling units. The N2 is an analog to more of the R2 zone, which permitted semi-detached, and those semi-detached are required to allow additional dwelling units, and that's where we get to 6 dwelling units. So that's really the biggest change I would say there. In terms of the subzone standards, and I'm kind of seeing in the chat there'll be more questions about kind of comparing the different subzones. In areas that are, I think, a bit further flung from those hubs and main streets, we generally tried to provide for standards in terms of things like yard setbacks and lot widths that are comparable to ones that you might encounter in the former bylaw. They're not always exactly the same, so they're ultimately an effect of compressing
So,
a bunch of different zoning standards. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I just want to clarify that Rhonda doesn't live in Britannia. Like
Oh, okay.
there are people from across
Fair
Bayward
enough.
on the call, and it's more just general, you know.
Yeah.
And our one
So,
doesn't exist anymore. That's the bottom line. But go
yeah,
ahead.
that's more generally speaking, I would say the R1s throughout Bay Ward would generally have gone to an N2 zone. So much of what I said um, would still be the case, like 3 versus 6.
Yeah. So you can ask more specific questions, but we'll move on for now. So Sophie's asking, what is the difference between N3B and N2C? And on Fraser, I see a different new zoning on the street depending if you're closer to Byron.
Thank you for the question. So, and Sammy off screen is, I think, bringing up this area in question to assist here. But very generally speaking, the N3, if you remember, there's a primary zone and there's a subzone, and generally where you see these get higher, particularly where we're talking closer to Byron Avenue, those are areas that are probably closer to the main street, in this case, Richmond Road, further north. So the N3B, because they're closer to that main street, is ultimately, I think, the more permissive zone. The N3 would permit up to like 12-unit apartment buildings or townhouses. The N2 would limit you to 6 units or maybe more in a semi-detached form. The B and C subzones are also, like I said, since they regulate the lot width and setbacks, generally the closer you are to the top of the alphabet, the more permissive those subzone regulations on lot widths are. Another thing that I don't think I may have glossed over a bit in the main presentation is that those areas that are closer to main streets may also, in a number of cases, may also be more permissive in terms of those lot width and setback standards, essentially also to facilitate a bit more of that built form, and again concentrate a bit more of those sort of permissions closer to those sort of main streets where more transit exists, more mix of uses, and more density may already exist. Whereas the C subzone, generally those subzones like C and D, we go further east, I see there's also N2D, may have standards that again are much more akin to the sort of size and location of building that would have been contemplated under the former bylaw. So even though there's more units permitted, there's not as much of a change in terms of the actual zoning standards as to how big a building can be and where a building can go, compared to those areas closer to major hubs and streets.
Okay, thank you. And if you need clarification on anything, please put yourself back on.
Yeah, sure.
And David is asking about concerns with the particular proposal on Compton Avenue. Currently it's zone N3, but the builder has asked for an amendment to increase the height from 3 stories to 4. And this is an increase from 8 meters to 11.5. The justification is that it will be zoned N4 this year. What provisions are in place to restrict heights in Wood Park? I don't know if you know which community is which park. That is, its boundaries are Carling to Byron,
yes,
between Woodruff and Lincoln Field.
Right.
Station.
There, right. Yeah.
So can I speak to this one? So I actually did watch the committee hearing for this file recently.
Oh, okay.
So one thing I noticed with this file was the mixture of what constitutes a semi-detached dwelling, how additional dwelling units will work within a semi-detached dwelling. So with this property, it is being rezoned to, I believe, an N3. and the height permissions were 11 meters, or they were approved as 11 meters across the city for N1 to N3 zones, except for some small areas. So in terms of the question of what provisions are in place to restrict heights, well, right now, because we're between both bylaws, between 2008 250 and 2026 50, the most restrictive provisions apply, meaning that if the height requirement in 2008 250 is less than the height requirement in 2026 50, we have to use the most restrictive between both bylaws. So the 8.5 or 8 meters would apply in this case. So what happened with this file is that the developer or property owner decided to apply for minor variance to go from 8 meters to 11.5, and it's up to the committee adjustment panel to decide if that's considered a minor variance or not, or minor in nature if it passes the 4 tests, or if it needs to go above them into either a minor rezoning or minor zoning bylaw amendment, or even a major one. So in terms of restricting heights, we're between both bylaws. The most restrictive applies between the two. So right now it's 8, but if the bylaw is fully enacted with these provisions, it will go to 11 meters going forward in the N3 zone.
Yeah, to build on that, because the question does, you're right, reference height specifically. If it goes to an N3 zone, yes, the height limit would in the new bylaw would be 11 meters. Now, since the question does talk about N4 zones, I'll maybe add kind of a note there. There are many N4 zones, not knowing the exact address on Compton, even though I know this went to the Committee of Adjustment recently.
177th.
Yes. Okay. I think that ended up in 3 in the end.
I believe so.
So
yes.
yeah, it would definitely be 11. It would definitely be 11 meters in that particular file. With respect to the N4 zones, if anyone's kind of looking at the zoning, they might encounter a lot of zones that may say something like N4B and then H bracket 11 at the end. And when we see something like an H11 at the end of the zoning code, that refers to what we call a height suffix. Height suffixes basically override what is in the underlying bylaw, basically saying that, like, despite what it says in the underlying bylaw, your height is limited to, if it's 11, then it's 11 meters, which is the same height as those lower density zones. I explain a lot of this because, generally speaking, there are a lot of our N4 zones specifically that are like that, because the direction that we ultimately landed on was 4-story heights are generally permitted in zones where the previous bylaw already permitted 4 stories. So if the old zoning permitted 8 or 11 meters, the height limit generally would not be above 11 meters.
Okay. Thank you. Question from Mary. Does a property still have to maintain 50% green space in the front yard, or can they pave interlock the entire frontage?
Thank you very much for the question. An excellent question. The answer is no. We really explicitly set it out so that one cannot pave over their entire front yard. So the front yard parking permissions, as I kind of alluded to before, when we permit front yard parking, we're really trying to limit it to the same sort of thing that you could get if you had got a driveway that was leading to a garage. So typically speaking, that still limits you to a maximum hard surface of, in any case, no more than 50%. And if we're talking about a particularly wide lot, there's additionally rules in a lot of neighborhoods that still limit the width of the driveway itself to 6 meters, which is generally wide enough for 2 cars. The minimum soft landscaping regulations I refer to also were basically set out a minimum aggregated soft landscaping area. Basically, you need an area, depending on the size of lot, anywhere between 30 and 40% of that front yard that has to be basically together in one area as like a soft scaped area. And again, it's going back to ensuring that there's enough space on a lot to allow for a tree. Even if a tree doesn't necessarily get planted, because unfortunately zoning can't go so far as to require that, we can at least ensure that there's still the space available for that.
Okay, thank you. So short answer, no, but
yes.
So, thank you. This is a very long question. It's kind of I think I'll be answering it. It's difficult to comprehend the additions of thousands of units in Bayward without infrastructure to support. Existing roads are in terrible shape, blah, blah, and sidewalks. Ottawa's hope of 15-minute neighborhood is in jeopardy. We must have safe, walkable pedestrian routes to accomplish this, and we must have services to support the influx of residents. We have no large community center with a pool, indoor rink, fitness, meeting space, etc., such as Nepean Sportsplex and others. Are there plans to add recreational complex to Bayward? And the answer is yes. I'll categorize it. First of all, we have 2 community buildings that have been accepted, and one is for Woodruff Park. We've got architectural drawings already processed, and the other is for Frank Ryan Park, and that's the same. So the funding will be coming in 2027 through development charges for Woodruff Park, and for the funding is 2028 for Frank Ryan. And that will mean replacing a field house with a building that has meeting space and kitchen and bathrooms, etc. So much more usable for the community. So those are 2 that I've been fighting for years, and they're coming up. We're also asking that the bus depot at the end of Queensview be, when it comes out of commission, to be used, that's city land, to be used as recreation complex. And that has been agreed upon. So that's a longer wait, but it is in the cards, and I've been pushing for that as well. We do need something in the inner urban area. We need more pools. We need more space for recreation of all kinds. So that one has been earmarked. So that's the answer for that. Okay. Is there any other questions?
Yes, there are just 2 others. I think the one from Jocelyn is about kind of a user question for Geo Ottawa. Just asking how to translate the colors on Geo Ottawa map into the new zoning rules. So Robert or Sammy, I don't know if you want to show how to use layers.
Maybe let's see if we can't share the Geo Ottawa here, because what you should be able to do, why don't we try clicking on that N3B?
Yeah, I was thinking.
Yeah. So we see there, it'll show the zone code of the area you highlighted, and also show a link to bylaw text. And that should take you to, in the case of an end zone, the neighborhood zones. And as you can see here, section 801 is really kind of the meat of it. And certainly it's a lot of bylaw language. These are like legal documents, so they're certainly quite detailed. The biggest ones that are probably, I think, of key relevance are those 2 tables, table 801A here, and then table 801B further down, because these will tell you, again, how many units are permitted in a building, how tall can that building be, how far does it have to be from lot lines. If we go back to Geo Ottawa, if you want to, say you're interested in the zone for like another part, let's say further up on Richmond, if we click on that purple, sometimes you have to do a bit of going back and forth, but it will show a Main Street zone, and so it'll take you to the mixed use zone. There are a number of different Main Street zones, so you do kind of have to note what the zone code is in order to kind of get into the right section. It's a bunch of different drop downs, but again, it'll go through, here's the type of uses that are permitted in a neighborhood zone, and here are the provisions for the zone. There'll be also, I think, some provisions for things like entrances, landscaping. If we go further down, you'll see like a table that lays out, again, that sort of things like height and setback provisions. How tall can a building be? How far does it have to be from lot lines?
Great. Super. Just a comment about trees. And the concern that many mature trees are being removed with development. And if you can talk about the tree protection bylaw a bit and efforts to keep our canopy.
Yes, thank you very much. So Ottawa does have a tree protection bylaw. Talking there at a very high level, basically it does set out regulations around both like protected mature trees on private property as well as trees on public property. We do have basically a whole forestry branch that basically deals with the tree bylaw as well as the whole process for trees in relation to infill development. If you want to legally remove a mature tree on site, that requires something called, I believe, a distinctive tree permit. And those forestry staff do have to review that. Generally, you do require things like a report from an arborist speaking to the condition of the tree. Generally speaking, there's a number of factors that go into it, and I obviously don't want to be inaccurate about what the bylaw says, but generally speaking, if it's not, for example, directly within like the middle of the permitted zoning envelope, it's generally not going to be. They're generally not going to support removal in cases where the tree is shown to be in good health, and generally speaking, where it's shown to be, for example, in poor health or otherwise in a state where the tree can be removed. There are regulations in the tree bylaw for some manner of compensation, which may potentially come in the form of new tree planting elsewhere.
Thank you. There is a strong effort on, and I do hear from communities when they're concerned about existing trees, and also trees age out, and so we need to continue to renew our tree canopy as well. And it is something we have. The forestry department is fantastic, and they are keeping an eye on and working closely. They wrote the tree bylaw, and the important part is that they look at the property before, at the very beginning of the process, so that trees are taken into consideration at the earliest stages rather than later, which is a disaster, to be honest. And it's like, oh, well, we designed this house and we can't keep the tree. No, you had to look at the tree first and then design your house on the property. So thank you for the question. We'll just take a couple of more because we're wrapping up soon. Development fees, will they be used to improve residential roads and sidewalks? Can we get a promise on that? Do you want me to take that, or do you want to? I can talk about it a bit.
Sammy, I don't know if you want to speak to it a bit.
No,
the development charge bylaw is a separate bylaw.
Right.
There've been a whole bunch of changes, partially at the provincial level, in terms of what we're even allowed to collect development charges
Yes.
on.
To keep costs down for developers, they've eliminated development fees. Pardon me. But we must have the residential roads and sidewalks. Obviously, in new developments, that's essential. And in older developments, in many cases, we have areas that didn't have a sidewalk in the first place. And we're working on getting some in. We've actually put a number of them in Bay Ward. So that's what's going on. We keep moving forward on that. Because this is an older neighborhood, we're not talking about new subdivisions. We take that, we just talked about this at committee the other day about the whole process and how we have to go to both the province and the federal government and say, look, you expect us to reduce costs, but we have costs and we need your help. And that is being presented both at the provincial level through the AMO, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Both are making this argument because it's not just us in the city of Ottawa are feeling that pinch. So you just can't have a house. You have to have a street. You have to have a system. You have to have roads. You have to have transit. We need to pay for these. And the less cost on property taxes, the better. It should be coming out of their pockets because they're expecting us to help developers build. So that's the short version. This will be the last question, and that is about water and sewer infrastructure and hydro capacity in places when we're doing infill. Maybe you guys want to talk about the process of how that's decided.
Thank you very much for that. So one section that I would draw attention to on the zoning side, we have in the new bylaw, section 201 of the zoning bylaw, which speaks to adequate servicing. And it essentially requires that a builder demonstrate that there be adequate services in place before a building permit. Much of the focus of this section is particularly on stormwater management, particularly because new buildings are often larger than the buildings that were previously there, particularly in infill scenarios. And so because that results in an increase in impervious surface, there's stormwater runoff that needs to be managed. So typically that there are things that we're kind of working on in terms of how in terms of how that's implemented. There were new programs that were implemented to basically address this, but essentially one way or another, a developer has to demonstrate through things like reports and engineering reports and plans prepared by a professional engineer that infrastructure is available to manage those sort of demands. More broadly, the city, in addition to its official plan, also has an infrastructure master plan, which I think more generally at a high level manages things like the timing and where throughout the city upgrades to those infrastructure facilities are more generally needed. But that's of course a much more citywide level, but there's also things that have to be done usually through things like servicing plans or grading plans to demonstrate to demonstrate that those services are adequate for individual developments. Sammy, not sure if anything to add there.
No, this section is brand new and it applies today as the most restrictive because it didn't exist before. So that's what we're working with today.
Yeah, but generally speaking, that is the checklist when you're getting new development is their capacity. Is there capacity to have these in the community? That's part of what the zoning process was too. We couldn't zone for more units if we didn't expect to have the capacity. So just in the overall general sense, that has been taken into consideration. And just as a reminder, we've been upgrading our system. For example, the whole point of tearing up Richmond Road was to redo the stormwater or the water capacity, sewer system, wastewater systems, because those we had infrastructure that was over 70 years old, and we've been upgrading them. That's what all that mess is of construction on Richmond Road. So we're, as a city, working our way through upgrading as well, which helps. So so that's a good thing. We don't want to end up like Calgary with, major problems because they have not kept up. This is, of course, it means construction. Nobody likes construction, but it is necessary, and that's what's going on. So it helps along the way. So that's a very good question to end with, and great questions. Thank you, and thank you, Sammy and Robert, for making some time this evening, and Kira, who's in the background from my office. Many have met her, who's been working on the development files, and Neve as well from my office. Thanks for your help in organizing this and getting this set up. So if people have further questions, the door's not closed. Please, you can continue to write, and we'll consult with Robert and Sammy or whoever else is applicable if it's a very specific question. So the email address is bayward@ottawa.ca, so you can send your questions in there. So I hope everybody has a good evening. I think there's a big hockey game on tonight. I've heard a rumor. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Thanks.